Hello and welcome to this edition of Top of Mind Florida. I'm Michael Williams.
And I'm Brian Crowley.
Good to have you with us as always. We're doing something a little different for this episode of Top of Mind Florida. We did a Zoom interview recently with a high-profile Democrat in the state of Florida, Anna Eskamani, Democrat out of Orlando.
Right, exactly, running for mayor.
And running for mayor in 2027, had a lot to say about a lot of the news, and there's plenty of it in Florida these days. Look in with us.
We have interesting news in Florida.
Yeah.
We're not the boring state?
No, we're
right,
not.
okay.
And as you listen to this interview, you see why. Join us.
Florida continues to be the epicenter of political chaos and uncertainty in the context of the extremism that is just all around us on issues like immigration, crosswalks, DI. I mean, you name it, it's being debated in Florida. But I would argue that the everyday challenges that our families face is what's top of mind for me. I mean, as a state legislator, it's important to note that Florida has some of the weakest safety nets in the country. And when a family is struggling, or someone loses their job, or you're falling behind on rent, the options to seek support are incredibly limited. And oftentimes they'll contact an office like mine for assistance. And we're seeing the uptick on unemployment cases. We're seeing the increase of folks who are contacting us because they're trying to prevent an eviction, or unfortunately those who already have an eviction and don't know what to do with it. So the economic challenges, from the cost of utility, the cost of healthcare, the cost of property insurance, all of that is top of mind, even though it doesn't get the attention it deserves. And I think, of course, for leaders in our state, the governor and others he's appointed, and those in the Republican Party have realized that they don't have the solution to solve these problems. So instead, they distract and deflect, and they divide, because that's the only path they see to maintaining their powers, by dividing our communities and pitting people against one another versus acknowledging these serious economic challenges that require accountability, that require reform, and require challenging large corporations who are profiting off the suffering of many of our constituents.
But one of the interesting things, and when I first started covering politics in Florida back in the Stone Age, Democrats overwhelmingly ran the state. Bob Graham was governor. Lawton Childs. It was just, and the voter registration was overwhelmingly Democratic. Obviously, we've seen a dramatic change with voter registration. Republicans now have a 1.3 million voter registration lead. What happened to the Democratic Party?
Non-existent. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And I mean, I appreciate this question because, we have to have a serious unpacking of the challenges the Democratic Party has faced, both in Florida and nationally. I think that COVID-19 is overlooked in the sense of its political consequences. We saw an era where individuals were faced with fear, uncertainty, and death. And though many of us looked at this moment to step up in the sense of providing comfort and security, I know for my office and myself, we spent hours as it pertains to the unemployment system, hours every night, in some cases 24 hours every day, responding back to Floridians that were suffering and not getting their unemployment benefits at time. I used my own salary to help cover the cost of rent and other types of expenses that families were facing. But then you had individuals who leveraged this pandemic to shift the political landscape, to pursue misinformation campaigns on vaccines and hydrochloroquine and other types of, YouTube rabbit holes that really have impacted how people see government, how people see our once respected institutions. And that erosion of trust opened up the door for a lot of folks to shift their political identities or to become politically active for the first time, but in a direction that I would argue is oppositional to values that actually address collective prosperity, that address poverty and so forth. Now, with that said, the Democratic Party has struggled for relevancy. And I do think a part of this is because you have a lot of Democrats who are just scared of their own shadow. They're hesitant to call out corporations in many cases because they accept hundreds of thousands of dollars from corporations. Florida and Power and Light, as an example. I'm one of the few Democrats who is willing to challenge them. I wrote and signed a letter to the PSC pushing back against their most recent rate hike request, which was one of the worst and the highest in the country. And having other Democrats sign that letter with me was a challenge. And I knew it would be a challenge because so many Democrats take hundreds of thousands of dollars from FPL. So at the end of the day, when you pull an everyday voter aside and you ask them, what's the difference between the two parties? A lot of folks say there isn't a difference. And that should alarm us because it hits a point where not only are folks just not going to vote, but they're going to vote for the candidate or the party that speaks to their sense of urgency. And even if it's just rhetoric from the right has co-opted a lot of the constituencies that I would argue Democrats have historically championed. But I think it's based upon the fact that not only is there a divestment of resources, the party struggles to even communicate to the public and do voter registration and so forth, but there is the reality that our party has been too scared to champion very important issues, and that has made us irrelevant in the face of the everyday electorate.
But have you all become too woke, as conservatives have alleged? They say we became a red state because the Democrats went too far left, too woke a party. And that you see that in the culture wars that have erupted. Why can't you punch through that message? How do you respond to that critique?
Well, it's an easy response. It's Republicans who've created those controversies, not us. I mean, at the end of the day, it was never Democrats that were, filing bills, for example, on Jennifer McCare and the Sunshine State. It wasn't us that were uplifting any of these topics. I mean, if you looked at the bills that Democrats were filing before these culture wars were fabricated, it had nothing to do with this issue, right? And of course, as Democrats, we have to be in the defensive to protect our diverse communities because we champion that. But it is important that we pivot back to those everyday economic issues to uplift what really is an issue of economics that they've exploited. And let me unpack this more. At the end of the day, the grievances that the Republican Party has uplifted as it pertains to, for example, issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, those grievances are legitimate. And what I mean by that is you have a population of everyday Americans who feel left behind. And whether it's because they don't see themselves in mainstream television, they didn't get that promotion at their place of work, but someone else did that maybe is of a different background. Like there are these real emotions that everyday voters have, that they feel like they're being left behind. They feel like the world is moving without them. And you can't deflect from that or accuse that person of being a racist. And I do think that's where, unfortunately, the social media chatter, which is not reflection of every political leader, but it does dominate, right, the ecosphere, because what ends up happening is all it takes is for Fox News to see one small isolated incident and then to expand it as if it's mainstream. And they're very good at that. They're very good at grabbing one isolated incident of, for example, violence perpetuated from an immigrant to an American citizen and say that every immigrant is dangerous, when data tells us that majority of crimes in this country are committed by U.S. citizens. But the conservatives are very good at propaganda. They're very good at grabbing an issue and exploiting it because they don't have values. They don't have morals. So when you don't have shame, you can kind of promote whatever message you want, right? And as Democrats who are too scared of their own shadow, we don't punch back. We don't fight back. And that's an issue that we have to get over. I mean, the number of Democrats during the 2024 cycle who told me not to talk about immigration because immigration didn't poll well, which of course I did not take that advice, were incredibly foolish, because what they did was they ceded the territory of this topic to the right. So the only message you heard was an anti-immigrant message. And if you don't provide a counter, then your community will never hear anything else. And all it takes is to hear the same information a few times for it to become truth. And so we do have to be willing to go into these tough topics. But I think the goal is to pivot back to the economy, to say, yeah, the values and the hard work of immigration is essential, and it also impacts your pocketbook, and here's why. So we always have to help folks understand how their self-interest is connected to the collective good. But if we're not willing to make that argument, which also includes holding corporations accountable, who unfortunately are also political donors of the Democratic Party, nothing's going to change. So we have to be willing to be brave, to be aggressive. And I don't consider that to be politically unpopular. If anything, here in Orange County, Democrats have continued to win elections. And it's based upon the fact that we have candidates who are willing to challenge both the tourism industry and developers. That's been our contrast compared to other parts of the state, and the voters recognize that.
You are 35 years old.
Yes, I am.
How would you?
We're jealous because we're not 35 years old.
I'm a tad older than that, 37.
Yeah, yeah.
How would you
We'll go
describe?
with that. Me too.
How would you describe your generation, 35 and younger?
Well, I'm a proud millennial, and I do think millennials offer a very interesting generational opportunity in the sense that we're bridge builders. So we're the gap between two very different generations. You know, when I was born in 1990, I did not have a cell phone. I did not have internet. Dial-up came to be in around 1997, 98. So I remember the AOL CDs you'd buy at Walmart, you know, and get, or, you know, and the fight over the phone when somebody was using the internet to need to make a phone call. I remember my first cell phone. And of course, I also experienced a lot of loss as a kid. My mom passed away from a fight with colon cancer when I was 13. And that was a trauma that I had to navigate and figure out how to live life without her. And that also came with financial challenges. So I think millennials went through the 08, 09, you know, housing crash and so forth. And so we have a lot of unique experiences, but generationally speaking, we can be that bridge between our Gen Xers, our boomers, and of course Gen Z and those who come after, because we can be relatable to both sides of the generational equation. So I see the role millennials play as essential. I think we are the ones who can calm the uncertainty. We are the ones who can counter the misinformation because, you know, we have trust with our elders, and in a way that is based on empathy, that's based on collaboration. And with that said, when I look at Gen Z, I see a very informed and passionate electorate. But it's very important, you know, as the Eskamani, if you will, that I play a role in educating my Gen Z staff and Gen Z interns on the systems that have led to the inequities they're so mad about. And how do you change those systems versus just on your phone, you know, commenting about it or posting about it. And I actually do credit this back to the pandemic. I think we have underestimated the impact of COVID-19 on the political environment, and especially on the left, where you have a lot of folks who call themselves organizers. They're not really organizing. They're just posting on the internet. And I get really frustrated by that because I know that's not organizing. And I know that you're not building power like that. You're not building power by just making viral TikTok videos. Like, you need to get off of your screen and knock on doors and talk to people who are different from you, not just say information to the internet that logarithms send to your audience, right? Like, you have to get out of that bubble. And I do think that we have to be aggressive about this point. The internet and social media companies, not only do they feed off our division and they make money off of it, but they intentionally silo us. And so when you only have exposure to one side of the argument and it's your side, then you're not going to be a persuasive debater. You're not going to be able to meet people who are different from you and inspire them to join you. And I want to emphasize, like, my district, I flipped my seat from red to blue in 2018, and I flipped it by being my authentic self. You know, obviously I work hard, I raise money, and I talk to voters at the doors and in community events and so forth. But we also champion corporate accountability. We champion reproductive rights. We champion issues that a lot of Democrats shy away from. The party did not think I was a viable candidate when I first filed. And now 7, 8 years later, you know, we're seen as one of the strongest voices in the Democratic caucus and as a messenger for our values statewide and nationally. And in that time frame, I have 1 precinct that voted for President Trump. And this is really, really important. 2 precincts in my district that voted for Trump voted for me in 2024. And these are voters that they're not necessarily driven by party. They're driven by who's going to stand up for them, who's going to fight for them, who's going to be accessible, who's going to make their life easier, who's going to make them more economically secure. And again, if they're voting for the so-called outsiders, right, people who don't come from the status quo, then I would argue that Trump has that perception, even though I believe firmly that that's not how he leads. But of course, from my lens, that is how I lead. So we need to be intentional in working with our different generations of voters. But I do think that younger voters are frustrated by what are broken systems. And instead of shaming them and not voting or shaming them and feeling that way, we need to meet them where they're at, empower and educate younger voters to help fix these broken systems.
Representative, in our remaining time, would like to get to your mayoral bid in 2027. But before we do, any discussion would not really be complete, Ryan, without a discussion about Alligator Alcatraz. I know you wanted to ask about that.
So I'm taking a slightly different approach here to Alligator Alcatraz with my question. What has struck me is while there have been a lot of talk about the environmental concerns, there seems to be little discussion about the impact on the individuals that were there or may still be there. And I would even include staff. The mosquitoes don't care whether it's a staff person or somebody being held in custody. And while most people would agree, yes, we have to get rid of the drug dealers and the murderers, it's, all that, that's not all of what's happening, as we all know.
Correct.
But there seems to be little talk about, and as individuals, people seem to be willing to sort of ignore what's happening to just individuals who never committed a crime other than being here illegally, being sent to a place like Alligator Alley. What do you think about that?
And we note as we take this, by the way, that of course this is shifting in the courts right now, but as a broad discussion, excellent thought and question, Brian. Your take?
Yeah. I mean, I empathize with the question because I see that all the time. As a daughter of immigrants, I have been very vocal and very public about not just my support of the immigrant community, but my opposition to what is happening, pushing back against local governments signing on to 287G agreements. I have visited my county jail to meet with detainees who are there on ICE holds. And of course, on July 3rd, myself and 4 of the lawmakers went to Alligator Alcatraz to demand access to conduct what is our statutory responsibility of oversight. Of course, we were denied access, but our point in doing that and arriving the same day detainees arrived was to elevate the human rights concerns and to elevate the lack of due process. And there are, of course, multiple lawsuits that have been filed. But to your point, the one that's gotten the most attention and the one that's gotten the most movement has been on environmental grounds. And I mean, candidly, the environmental lawsuit and the environmental arguments are very strong. And so I do think that's one reason why that lawsuit is the one that has movement, that has the most attention, is that it is a lawsuit that not only does it attract the support of a broad base of everyday Floridians and Americans who, again, to your point, might not necessarily share in my same opinions about immigration, but and how it's being enforced right now, but they do share on protecting the Everglades. They can relate to the goals of this litigation, the goals of this lawsuit. But right now, I have a caseload of 25 different people who have been detained in different capacities, including youth counselors who work in some of our areas of concentrated disadvantage, including faith leaders, including dads, including brothers. And so the attention for me is everywhere. Obviously, I serve as a witness in this lawsuit. With my testimony was cited in the order of the injunction, so I'm very proud of that. But the work as it pertains to lifting up the stories of everyday immigrants to break the stigma that, again, the far right has been very effective in spreading, alongside trying to get pro bono legal aid support to immigrants, alongside helping folks know their rights. I mean, all of that has been paramount for me.
So real quickly, something that you may not be aware of that you and Michael have in common, and to some degree I have in common. You have a twin. Michael has a twin.
What?
I have more in common with your older brother. I have 2 brothers who are twins.
Oh my gosh.
I understand the burden your brother has had to have his whole life. I'm sure he started out where he was the guy walking down the street and everybody paid attention to that little kid. And you 2 showed up
Okay. Well, we'll get to
Twins are the best.
we'll have our own Twin Day celebration.
Yes, for sure.
Listen,
That's great.
Representative, and I should say Dr. Eskamani, UCF, a proud UCFer, who went to UCF, born and raised in Orlando, and ultimately earned her doctorates. In our remaining moments, as us twins sit here, you are going to be running for Orlando mayor in 2027. Is that, at least in part, an acknowledgement that Democrats simply are going to be on the outside looking in Tallahassee for a long time? Is it, in some ways, waving a white flag, say, I can't get anything done there, I'll try and do it at the more local grassroots level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an acknowledgement that I am 35 years old, and I think it's important to have an impact where you are. And I believe firmly in measuring your ambition. I had an amazing political science professor when I was a senior at UCF, and it was my first ever A minus, and I almost cried about it. And he looked at me and said, Eskamani, you're a bright star. You're a bright star, but bright stars burn out really fast. And that always stuck out to me in the sense of it's wonderful when things, when folks push you and encourage you, to make these leaps. But at the end of the day, you have to trust your gut. And the city of Orlando, where I live, and of course where I grew up, is a beautiful city, and it has so much potential to continue to be a place where you can live, work, and play, where you can have collective prosperity. And I not only do I want to deliver on that, but I feel like building more executive leadership opportunities for myself and for my team and those around me, and to prove to people that as a Democrat and as a younger generational Democrat, I know how to solve problems, and we're going to make your life better, sets all of us up for success long term. I've made the point for years that for Democrats, it has to be a 10-year, 20-year strategy in Florida, not a 2-year strategy. And I don't want to burn out too fast.
Again, Anna Eskamani, Democrat from Orlando, state legislature since 2018, now going to be running for mayor in Orlando. Brian, thoughts?
Did you like the fact that I pointed out that you both are twins?
Yes, I pointed out the twin lineage in our families, and yes,
she smiled about that.
She did. She
didn't realize that you were a twin, and that she's a twin, and that I am the older brother of a couple of youngsters that are twins, and. I know what we have to go through, we older siblings, dealing with young twins. It's not easy.
That'll be for another episode.
We have a secret organization that talks about that.
To the news of the moment, and she talked about a lot of the issues, everything from environment to the general state of politics to Democratic frustrations in Tallahassee and on and on. Your thoughts, Brian?
Well, she shows some promise being 35 years old. She shows some promise for the Democratic Party of Florida as it desperately tries to build a future. In the last couple of years, the voter registration for Republicans is 1.3 million higher than it is for Democrats, after many decades of Democrats having higher voter registration. The Democratic Party in Florida has been crumbling pretty much since Jeb Bush won in 1998 in his race for governor. And, some elements of the Democratic Party in Florida are hoping that people like her could be that next generation that helps build the party back.
Being a mayoral candidate for a large, burgeoning and ever-growing city like Orlando, being a candidate for that is a big deal. And yet, we talked to her about this in the interview, and I'd like your take. It is a reminder that Democrats feel like they're always on the outside looking in Tallahassee and can't get a lot done. And does it also say something to you about the fact that the Democratic Party is not doing a great job of recruiting and plowing the field for candidates who can have a bigger statewide profile?
Well, the party needs to build from the ground up. Mm-hmm. That's what the Republicans had to do over the last, couple of decades. So you need to win those school board races. You need to win those city council races. You need to win those county commission races. And from there, you start getting your crop of people that build and start running for statewide offices. You need to, concentrate on some state house and state senate races. And those are the kinds of things you have to do to build the party. But the other problem the Florida Democratic Party has is the national party has all but abandoned the state. Mm-hmm. So they have a tough time raising money. They've pretty much stopped investing in this state because they don't see much of a future right now, and they have to concentrate the resources on states that they think have a better chance. And the Republican, and if you look at the Republican Party in Florida, you look at Ron DeSantis and some of the other elected officials, they tend to be, 50 and younger. And in Ron DeSantis' case, for example, he was in his late 30s and early, when he became a member of Congress. He was in his early 40s when he became governor. And that's the kind of generational switch that you need, that they're looking at.
And also, I am reminded of the fact that already early in the cycle, well, perhaps not too early in the state of Florida politics, but you already have people vying, Byron Donalds, Paul Renner, and the list will keep growing, who want to be governor next year. I defy you to name, or anybody at home, can you name any Democrats who you say are top of mind for you right now?
Right.
And it does bespeak some of the issues that the Democrats have trying to get traction at that level.
Well, you have Dave Jolly, is the only, a former Republican who became a Democrat who's running to be governor, and the only right now.
Which in and of itself sort of says where the Democratic Party is.
Well, some people think we're doing Charlie Crist over again,
The
which
Republican
is a little
indie
unfair
Democrat.
to David Jolly. But in the governor's race on the Republican side, you have Congressman Byron Donalds.
Right.
You have
President Trump
recently
supports him.
appointed Lieutenant Governor Jay Collins, who I think has lived in the state all of 6 years. Paul Renner, the former House Speaker, and still some talk that it could be Casey DeSantis could get in. I think, moving off to the side here a little bit, I think the DeSantis family has a big crisis in front of them as Ron DeSantis enters his final year and a half, less than a year and a half as governor. They're a middle-class family before he came governor. Suddenly he's got a mansion, he's got a private jet plane, he's got personal security, 24-hour house staff.
When you say a private jet plane or the state-run jet plane?
Well, the state plane,
and
right.
the governor's mansion.
That he spends many millions.
Not his own mansion, not a private mansion.
Be careful. He thinks it's his. And so, they got to figure out with their 3 kids, where are we living next? Life is going to change dramatically. So, that could be one of the reasons why Casey DeSantis may consider running.
Let me press you on this, though, Brian, and you talk about it a lot. You keep your ear to the ground on the political scene as well as anybody I know. Representative Eskamani, we talked to her about it. She pushed back on it. She thought Democrats were too shy, were not forceful enough in their message. The other argument for perhaps many of you watching this, you might say it's not about not being forceful enough. We just don't like any of your message. How much of it is Democrats are not doing a good enough job marketing their message versus not having one, or people in this red state just say, we're not buying what you're selling no matter how you package it?
Well, I mean, look, the leader of the Republican Party is Donald Trump. When he first started running, he created a message that, Republicans adopted wholeheartedly. I mean, the entire Jeb Bush clan got pushed aside. When you look at a family that started out with a senator, and then somebody who becomes vice president, then a second member of the family becomes president, Jeb Bush becomes governor, and then all of a sudden, I mean, the Bushes were beloved by most Republicans. And then it ended. Donald Trump comes across with a whole new message that Republicans, who eventually become MAGA, bought into, and in part it was because he keeps his message simple and understandable. Democrats tend to get into the weeds, and they tend to talk about things in ways that most people just kind of shrug off. And they need to simplify their message and talk about things that really matter to the average voter, and they're not very good about that. And one of the big items that, and I've been saying this for decades, you've heard me say it, is the economy, the economy, the economy. Whether you think we're having a good economy, a bad economy, or whatever, Trump and his followers are very good at targeting it and telling you everything's wonderful even when it isn't. Democrats tend to be all over the place on those kinds of issues, or they tend to get distracted by other issues that don't matter as much to the average voter.
We'll have to leave it there, but no version of Top of Mind Florida or our many years of working together is complete without final thought or Crowley closer.
Well, my final thought is I want to thank everybody who's been watching or listening Top of Mind Florida. I hope you let others know and subscribe. And thank you so much for being a part of it. And we've had some great guests, and we've got some great guests coming up in the weeks ahead. And I think you should look forward to it.
Thanks for being with us.